Welcome everyone. Today I have the pleasure to welcome Joel Sercel, the CEO of TransAstra. Hey Joel, how's it going?
Hey, it's great, Jeremy. How are you today?
Pretty good, pretty good. I'm very excited to have you on board today on this podcast. We have a pretty good topic to discuss to get today because we're going to discuss about capturing different satellites directly on space. So I'm very an asteroid. So I'm very excited to first to try to understand like a little bit more about your background. What was your background before starting your company? We're going to discuss as well, like obviously about like your strategy, how you're planning to achieve that vision. But first, let's start about your background to try to better understand this.
Sure. My background is a PhD in mechanical engineering with a thesis in plasma physics and space propulsion from Caltech. Um, that I did that while I was working at JPL. I worked for JPL for uh, 14 years, and then I've also consulted in the aerospace industry and various different technology industries. I've held various different government jobs running space efforts for the government and also innovation efforts to develop innovative new systems. And, I've just been a space nut all my life. So that's the background. And uh, how's that for starters?
Yeah, it's perfect. So I want to try to better understand like how did you create your company? How did you come up with the idea? Where does like the vision come from? And if you can maybe share like a little bit more about like what is TransAstra?
Yeah, sure. So TransAstra is a very unique space technology company that's developing a handful of breakthrough technologies that we think will have a profound impact on the industrialization of space. The vision of TransAstra is to build the systems and technologies that we're working on into businesses today that,
Mhm.
when you put them all together, enable TransAstra to start harvesting in a very big way the resources of the asteroids. We're
Mhm.
fundamentally motivated by an optimistic view of the human potential and the human spirit, with the knowledge that human beings are an exponentiating species. That we grow and we're vibrant and thriving when we're growing. When we're growing our our ability to thrive in our environment, when we're growing our population, when we know that our children will have a better life than we did, and their children will have a better life than them, and so on. Those are the keys to happiness for humans. And humans we now have 8 billion people spread all over the globe.
Mhm.
The human population, for it to continue to grow, needs to make the leap into space. We need to be an exoplanetary species that can live and thrive in the environment of space. And the resources of the asteroids and the moons of the solar system are the key to making that happen. That's what motivates us. Um, TransAstra was built out of thinking that I've been engaged in literally all my life, literally since my childhood. Um, when I was in high school, there was a professor at Princeton University named Gerard K. O'Neill, Jerry O'Neill, to those of us who knew him, um, who was a brilliant physicist,
Mhm.
but also a visionary and a very deep thinker about problems of humanity. And back in the 70s, there was this view that we were certainly running out of oil. We were totally running out of oil. And, there'd be no oil. Uh, Per capita energy consumption was going to crunch. There's going to be an economic depression. It was over for humanity. And back in those days, there was deep concern about the effect of humanity on the climate. And the climate was going to collapse and was going to get very cold. And there was a bunch of intellectuals who had written papers and documents. There was a group called the Club of Rome who said, limits to growth. Humans have to pull our horns in and stop. And there was a sense of pessimism in the air. And
Mm.
he assigned a group of his brightest students at Princeton a very interesting problem. And that was the problem, um, given the nature of what humans are, for a technically advanced species, that's where we're headed, where should people live and how should we live? And the students came back with a very surprising answer. And the answer was not on the surface of planets, because the surface of planets are fundamentally limited. And the real resources in the solar system are between the planets, in the moons and asteroids. And, and, you know, and the students came back and said, there's enough resources in the asteroids of our solar system to build worlds that are Earth-like to the inhabitants of those worlds, terrestrial environments, natural environments, that sort of thing, with 1,000 times the carrying capacity of the Earth, 1,000 times the land area of the Earth, that can support a population of 1 trillion people. That's what the basic physics and engineering says. And in order to make it work, the economics have to change a bit. We have to have low-cost access to space and large-scale space manufacturing. And so as a teenager, I was convinced that before the end of the 20th century, these things would be happening, because people were projecting that the space shuttle would be a cost-effective launch vehicle. Well, it turns out the space shuttle didn't work. It kind of slowed us down by 30 or 40 years. It worked in the sense that it got people to space, not safely, but it got them to space. But it was in some ways the most expensive launch vehicle ever built. And so it really set back all the ambitions of space industrialization and space settlements and that sort of thing. So I started my career at NASA and at JPL as a young man, and then picked up my PhD at Caltech along the way, with the idea that the inevitable destiny of humans is to live in the high frontier. But it became clear to me that all the cool work that NASA and JPL do, they're not contributing to really making it cost effective to get into space, or at least they weren't. And that the industrialization of space was not going to happen unless there was some fundamental sea change. But I always had this interest in asteroid resources for the long-term betterment of humanity. For us to continue to do what we do as humans, which is to grow and multiply, have children, the population growth, and for our physical well-being to continue to improve, it requires increased energy consumption, both on a per capita basis, except for moderate changes due to increases in efficiency and so on, and then globally as a species. And so in order for that to happen, we have to dip into the resources of the solar system in ways that we haven't done it. This is sort of something that I've always found to be axiomatically true. I remember back in the year 2000, some consultants called me and said, "Hey, there's this guy who wants to meet you, who's starting a space company, and he's willing to hire you as a consultant to help him set it up." And I was like, "That's fine. Who is he?" And he said, "Well, his name is Jeff. He operates this website called Amazon.com." And at the time, Jeff was like barely even a billionaire. He only had like $7 billion or something like that. And it turns out that in talking to him back then, and I spent many hours in meetings with him back in those days when I was helping him strategize the approach to Blue Origin, it's clear that he grew up with the same assumptions that I did, absolutely the same. And then later on, I was working as a management consultant and doing a study of disruptive changes in technology about the time that SpaceX was doing early launches of the Falcon 1, so in the mid to late OOs. And, I'd known Gwen Shotwell, who's this brilliant executive who runs SpaceX, and did an interview for about an hour and a half with Elon about what's changing, what's happening with space technology. And it's very clear that Elon has the same view. Humanity has to get into
Mm.
space. Where he and I differ is he thinks we live on a planet, so we have to always live on planets in the future. So he wants to go to Mars. Um, that's a cognitive bias that Isaac Asimov called planetary chauvinism. Chauvinism is where you think, well, if it's always been like that, and it's the center, that's how it always should be in the future. Planetary chauvinism is people live on planets, so we have to live on Mars. But you can't create an Earth-like environment on Mars. You just can't do it. It doesn't have the gravity. Whereas you can create Earth-like environments on human-made, on giant robotically made worlds in space. These are, and these worlds start with just, being small, like, kilometers across, like the size of an island. And then later they can grow to be very large. Um, uh, but you can create an Earth-like environment with Earth normal gravity, Earth normal radiation, Earth normal atmosphere. You can do that in space, working with materials harvested in space. You can't do that on the moon or Mars. And we don't know if humans can adapt biologically to live in those environments. And even if you did, if you went to Mars, it's basically the land area of Mars is like Africa. So
Mm.
you'd burn through that in terms of population density in about 30 years. So for humanity to continue to really grow, you got to think asteroids. Now, that's kind of a philosophical discussion. That's not really business. Like,
Mm.
like if someone goes to a businessman and said, hey, I got a deal for you. I want to build worlds in space for 1 trillion people. They're like, I wonder what drugs this guy's been on. So it's one thing to talk about that from a philosophical perspective on the basic science and engineering and economics. But it's another thing to have a really vibrant and growing business. Now, it turns out that Jeff and Elon and lots of other people are working on some of the fundamental issues for humanity to get into space in a big way. And the two biggest issues are low-cost access to space, which is why both Jeff and Elon have reusable rockets to make that a lot cheaper relative to what it was 10 years ago over the next 5 to 10 years. It's already come down by factors of several, maybe
Mm.
factors of more than 10, but it'll come down by another factor of 100 or so in the next 10 years. That's a big deal. But even if you solve that, you haven't solved the problem because space hardware is too expensive. And so, like when great organizations like JPL build these exquisite things that go to Mars and explore Mars with these rovers, that hardware costs upwards of $1 million a kilogram. So for
Yeah.
those who think in pounds, that would be 2 million. That would be about a $500,000 a pound. And so you can't build big spacecraft for affordable. So you got to get the cost of building things in space way down also. And so there's great strides being made on that. And, it does look as though the new generations of satellites that are being built are like 1% as expensive as the old fashioned satellite. It used to cost like $250 million to put a satellite in geostationary orbit. Many ways, the capability of the big LEO constellations that are being built, especially Starlink, are superior to those geosatellites. And really reasonable business and engineering estimates of what SpaceX pays for each one of those satellites is instead of circa $100 million, it's circa less than $1 million. That's a huge improvement. And so with the cost coming down, it leaves some other fundamental problems that are unsolved in order for us to harvest asteroid resources. And what we've found is that we can invent the solutions to those problems and build businesses on those solutions with that new technology. So there are 4 different technological areas that we're working in, that we're building businesses. And as we build the businesses on the basis of those 4 technologies, TransAstra will grow. We put all those 4 things together, plus low-cost launch, low-cost space hardware, and bingo, it makes sense to start harvesting the resources of the asteroids. Today, the economics of it don't make sense at all, but as we evolve, it will. So that's a vision thing. But what I do every day is build a very real and practical company on these 4 fundamental problems that we're addressing.
Because as of right now, what is the biggest driver of the cost of the satellites? I mean, that the launch is clearly like the biggest driver. And if you try to harvest like the resources like from Asteroid and try somehow to to troubleshoot like the way to manufacture those satellites directly like in space, is that like the main, I mean, saving and cost reduction that you can make to make it like
No,
more affordable?
it's not initially about manufacturing in space, although we'll get there soon. It's about manufacturing on the ground. So most satellites, well, let's see, a lot of the money that still goes into satellites today is going to sort of old-fashioned companies that build satellites much the same way that we built satellites in the 70s and 80s, the 2000. And this is a very 20th century, one might even say 19th century manufacturing method, where you design these exquisite systems, you have highly trained engineers and technicians assemble them. They're assembled one at a time by hand without advanced manufacturing technologies. Every little change has to be documented in detail, and the heritage of every part has to be tracked all the way back to the mine where the material was literally tracked back to the mine where the materials was harvested to make sure it has the right pedigree so it could go and be qualified to use in space. And that's why, like like this book is about a kilogram. So 1 kilogram of space hardware um, is $1 million. So if you have 1,000 kilogram spacecraft, you know, in very round numbers, you can get up to $1 billion of cost. And certain DoD space assets and assets, like spy satellites and NASA satellites cost that much, from a few $100,000 to $1 million a kilogram to make. It's because of this old-fashioned manufacturing technique. Just the process of really sitting back and thinking about how we manufacture systems and building factories to be very cost effective, the way this stuff is produced, or the computers that we're talking on are produced, can reduce that cost by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, 100 to 1,000 times. And for
Mm.
example, a little camera on a spacecraft called a star tracker.
Mm.
Um, if you go to buy a star tracker from a commercial space company today, it's a little camera that's not much more than a webcam. It'll cost you $40,000. But if you apply advanced manufacturing methods, you can get effectively the equivalent camera to use as your star tracker. And really, it shouldn't cost more than $25.
Mm.
And we think there are people who are doing that today. They're just not selling them for those prices because they can put them on their own satellites and build their satellites where a whole satellite, instead of costing $50 or $100 million, costs less than $1 million. And if you can produce a star tracker for $25, it makes no sense to sell it for $25 when other people are selling them for $40,000. So as more competition enters the marketplace, those costs will come down. So, but we are utterly convinced, and I think the evidence is overwhelming, that the cost of space launch and the cost of space hardware are coming down so much that it makes sense economically to mine asteroids. But there are 4 problems that are not being solved by the rest of the community to enable asteroid mining. And those 4 problems are what we call detect, move, capture, and process. There are 4 things
Mm.
you need to do to make asteroid mining make sense. You have to find more asteroids. So NASA's done a great job, very expensive. It cost way too much for them to do this, unfortunately. But, it's government agencies and they are what they are. They're great people. They're doing their best, but it's not cost effective. They've done a great job of finding all the big dangerous asteroids that might come and destroy cities or destroy the Earth. Like 90% of them, probably. But they've only found about 0.04% of all the little asteroids that would be good mining targets, because the telescope technology is just not up to the job, and they really haven't implemented creative approaches. So we have patented and invented breakthrough telescope technology that people like the Space Force are going like, we need this because we can go and find a lost spacecraft at 500,000 kilometers from the Earth. We can find a spacecraft the size of a refrigerator that's lost 500,000 kilometers from the Earth with our telescopes. Our telescopes cost pennies on the dollar compared to the kind of telescopes that NASA uses for asteroid finding. So detect, move. We need better ways to get around in space that are much more practical. Today's space transportation systems are based on rocket engines. Rocket engines were basically invented by the Chinese 1,000 years ago. Smoke, fire, explosions, danger, toxicity, all that kind of stuff. Or electric propulsion systems. Electric propulsion systems are very sophisticated technology. I mean, my PhD is effectively in plasma physics. That's what I did for my thesis at Caltech. Plasma physics. They're very expensive, sophisticated systems that move slowly in space. And time is money, so we need faster, cheaper propulsion systems. So we've invented those and patented those. And then when you want to harvest asteroids, you have to capture them. So we like to joke that the only thing that we know of that can actually land and walk around an asteroid is Bruce Willis, and he's not available. So like you see science fiction movies about landing on asteroids. You can't land on an asteroid. In fact, you see the press reporting that NASA or the Japanese Space Agency has landed on an asteroid to collect samples. It's not true. Nobody has ever landed on an asteroid. No one will ever land on an asteroid because asteroids, although they technically have gravity and you can use your high school physics to calculate how much how much gravity they have. If you or I were there in a spacesuit, we would not notice the gravity. You can no more land on an asteroid than you can land on the International Space Station. If you try to land on the International Space Station, you will bounce off. And it's hard, and you can't even grapple with an asteroid. If you go to grapple with an asteroid, like let's say you rendezvous with the asteroid, you touch it, and you say, aha, I'm at the asteroid. I'm going to hold on to it. You grab the rocks and then come floating off in your hand and you float off into space. Those asteroids aren't held together by pretty much anything. They're just like held together by electrostatic forces and whatnot. So all the so-called landers on asteroids have actually been things that have bounced off asteroids. In fact, there's this really cool spacecraft that NASA paid over $1 billion for to bring back less than a kilogram of sample from an asteroid called OSIRIS-REx. I mean, exquisite science and technology. And people said it landed on the asteroid. No, it didn't. In fact, when it hit the surface of the asteroid, it didn't even slow down. It kept going. And it turns out the asteroid's surface was more like dust bunnies than rocks. And it just kept going and going and going. And the accelerometers didn't even notice that it touched the surface. And it would have probably gotten buried in the asteroid, except that they took the sample, fired the rocket motors, and got out of the asteroid. So if you want to harvest the resources of asteroids, you have to capture them in bags. And so we've been working on capture technology, capture them in bags. And then we've been working on process. So the four things are detect, move, capture, and process. We've been working on the processing technology to process that material into useful materials for engineering in space. First thing that we'll harvest from asteroids are the ingredients for rocket propellant to turn them into gas stations. So those are our four basic technology areas. Detect. We have a whole network of telescopes. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was down in Australia checking out a new telescope that we just installed down there. We have in our laboratory 2 big test chambers with all the capability for testing and developing our breakthrough omnivore solar thermal rocket. Capture bag, we won a Time Magazine Invention of the Year award last year for our capture bag technology, which we originally developed for capturing asteroids. That's the long-term vision. But there's all this debris in Earth orbit that needs to be cleaned up. And we're looking at capturing the debris in Earth orbit and then bringing it to recycling centers and then using our material processing technology, which we started for our vision of asteroid mining, to recycle materials in space. And that'll get us to space manufacturing. And then the last one is material processing. Now, the way we process materials and the way we extract materials from mines here on the Earth is very, very challenging for the environment. It uses a lot of energy, uses a lot of things like water. It creates pollutants in the atmosphere or in the water tables. It creates these large uh, piles of rubble, which can form slurries and form mud. And then they build dams to hold that in. Sometimes those dams break. There have been a couple of huge incidents where they've wiped out towns.
Mm.
But in space, you can't work with water. You can't use water as a reagent to process materials. Electric power is still way too expensive. So we've found out, and you have a vacuum of space. It's a completely different environment. So we've invented materials processing technologies that take advantage of all that and sunlight, which is plentifully available in space to do materials processing. Well, it turns out that there are terrestrial applications of green material processing for that here on the ground. So the businesses that we're building based on our detect technology, it's telescopes for finding spacecraft and lost objects in space. And the Space Force and other government agencies like NASA are very excited about this. And we make millions of dollars a year from the Space Force for building and operating our telescopes to help them find things in space.
Yeah, that's very important.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, Joel, but that's very important because you have that big vision where you know where you're going, you know like which type of technologies you need to develop, but you've been like implementing that um, strategy with short-term milestones that allows you to get there, and that's really
Exactly.
like yeah allows you as
Yeah.
well to start working on all four technologies right away
Bingo.
with like short-term milestone. That's really important to
Yeah,
highlight, right?
and these milestones are not milestones that, it's just a milestone and it builds to another milestone and it builds to another milestone. And eventually in 100 years, you get to your destination. That's not it at all. These milestones are about making money along the way. And by the way, we're not the only ones who are doing this. That's
Mm.
exactly the plan that SpaceX has.
Mm.
People think about, people love their Starlink antennas that give them a wonderful internet into their homes from the Starlink communications network. But that network was built and operated by SpaceX to make money now. And oh, by the way, they need that communications technology to communicate with their vision of getting to Mars. Likewise, people love to see the SpaceX launch rockets, launching astronauts into space and delivering satellites for customers all over the world. That's wonderful. It's a wonderful business today for SpaceX and Elon and Gwen and all the wonderful people at SpaceX. They're making a lot of money on it, but make no mistake, every one of those launches and everything they're doing and the Starship development, it's all directed towards their vision of eventually building a city on Mars.
Mm.
Jeff Bezos is doing the same thing with Blue Origin. People see Jeff Bezos go into space on his New Shepard rocket, and they look at people like William Shatner flying into space and other things like that, and they see this big rocket called the New Glenn that he's developing, and he's building the Orbital Reef space station. And you think, well, Blue Origin is building all these businesses right now to make money. That's true, but Blue Origin has the vision of millions of people living and working in space for the betterment of humanity. That's very much like TransAstra's vision. And they're
Mm.
building the pieces of it that they see as critical. We're building the pieces of it that we see as critical. So this is this approach of long-range vision for the betterment of humanity and the planet, driving our motivation, and then building businesses in the here and now that can return value for our shareholders. This is not a unique idea. But we're very excited about both the vision and the reality of our technologies and our businesses today.
Can you just detail a little bit more, like again, what's the short term milestone for each of those different four technologies? So telescope, we
Sure.
understand right now they deploy on ground. You have contract with the Air Force, with the Space Force to basically detect like any type of satellites, vehicle, small size vehicle on space. We understand the use
Yep.
case, and that allows you to develop the technology. What about like the
Perfect.
three other?
Well, for the detect area, which includes our Sutter ground network, we also intend to fly Sutter telescopes in space because you can see better in space, and there's a need for that. There are things you just can't see from the ground, that you can see better in space. So that's part of the plan. And we're working on that every day, developing the sponsorship and the technologies to make that happen. With regard to Move, we have our cornerstone omnivore solar thermal rocket. What's really cool about omnivore is that it can use virtually any propellant. What some people call fuel. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It doesn't need fuels. It can use virtually any volatile fluid as propellant, whether it be water, ammonia, liquid hydrogen. And what's cool about that is it makes it very versatile and very robust. And when we put liquid hydrogen in these engines, they are just amazing in terms of their performance for delivering payloads to very distant, high speed destinations, lots of delta V. And then we can also run them with water, which we can harvest from the asteroids. And so we have studies that have been funded by NASA to look at their applications, and also technology development to actually develop the engines in our laboratory. Now, jumping from Move, which is pillar number 2, to Process, which is pillar number 4, they both have something in common, which is they both use concentrated sunlight as their energy source. Now, the sun is, if you're a tree, the sun is a great energy source here on the ground, because you don't need constant power of the same level every day reliably. But here on the ground, the sun is a little bit problematic as an energy source because of clouds and seasons and that sort of thing. So for example, I have a 10 kilowatt solar array on my house. If that solar array was in space, it would put out 240 kilowatt hours every day of energy. But averaged over the year, even in sunny Southern California, where it's beautiful and sunny today, it only puts out about 25 or 30 kilowatt hours. So typically about a tenth of what it would do in space. And the difference is solar power in space is very consistent. It's perfect. And if you put a solar reflector up in space and concentrate that sunlight into a small circle, you can vaporize virtually any material known to science. There's only one compound that I know that you can't vaporize with sunlight in space. Thoria. Pretty much anything else you can melt, crumble, vaporize in vacuum in space. And so it's ideal for materials processing. It's also ideal for powering rocket engines. So our omnivore rocket engine, it couldn't be simpler how it works. The rocket engine has a window with a high temperature window material. And you have a large lightweight solar concentrator that concentrates the sunlight into that window. And inside of it is a special material that absorbs that sunlight, gets really hot. And then we pass the rocket propellant through that material. It heats up to super high temperature and gets squirted out to produce thrust. That's the omnivore propulsion system. It has very important commercial applications today. There's a new generation of small launch vehicles that are being developed for very low cost access to space for small spacecraft. The challenge that those small rockets have is they really can't deliver much to GEO or beyond. But if you put an upper stage with our omnivore propulsion system, they can. And that's an incredibly powerful commercial application in the near term. And then in the medium and long term, there are lots of other applications. And eventually, we will build really large, one might say giant, space tugs that can tug massive payloads around Earth orbit and cislunar space using our omnivore propulsion system. But both the omnivore propulsion system and our materials processing use the same solar reflectors to concentrate the sunlight. And so our space architecture uses that with inflatable structures. We have another application of inflatable structures that's critical to our architecture, and that is for capturing asteroids, we can use inflatable bags like that are made of membranes that are chemically not too dissimilar to mylar balloons. They're ripstop, they're tough, they're radiation proof, they're thermally resistant, but similar to the material in a mylar balloon. And we'll eventually use that to capture fairly large asteroids in space and use solar concentrators, send sunlight into the capture bags. And we have this all worked out from an engineering perspective in order to heat the material. And we've actually done dozens of experiments showing that highly concentrated sunlight can drill holes in rock. It can chew apart the material of asteroids. It can heat it, cause it to release its valuable materials. We've done lots of experiments to that effect. But the capture bags can also be used for orbital debris cleanup. So we currently have about $1 million in NASA funding to develop that technology and about $1 million in Space Force funding. And they are heavily motivated by the commercial applications here. But the commercial investors are saying it needs to be a little bit more mature. So this government funding is a great stopgap before we put significant venture funds into it. And we have raised several $1 million of venture funding. And we're holding off until just the right time to do the next raise to put some of this technology into space.
It's amazing, like to just like see on your side both like the vision and at the same time like the business strategy coming along together just to reach your objective. It's great to see that.
We love it, man. I got to tell you, it's the best job in the world.
SpaceX, I would say, like, and because they were really like, I think, like the first to really bring that cost down, like on the launch system and really bring a lot, I think, to the industry. How did that influence like your the way you've been creating your business and the company, the strategy on the company?
Had a huge impact. In fact, I have to tell you, in the time frame of about 2012, I was pretty down on space. It was still dominated by governments and multinational corporations. It really didn't do much, if anything, to make it more cost effective. I mean, there was a lot of sort of bad news. Not terrible news, but just bad news. The space shuttle has proven itself to be unsafe. Astronauts died. Space shuttle was canceled. And here's a statistic that is kind of sad. In the 1980s, the United States had a 100% market share of global launch, commercial global launch. Like if anyone was putting a commercial satellite into space anywhere in the world, they hired the Americans. But by that time frame of about the 2008 time frame, that market share dropped to essentially zero because the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians had more cost-effective rockets. But I was making my money as a consultant in those days, and a consulting client who knew that I knew space and so on hired me. That they were looking at buying a SpaceX rocket, and they said, we want to look at whether we should launch on the Falcon 9. It's this new rocket that Elon is developing. He's making all these bold claims. Everyone we talk to doesn't believe the claims. But we've heard that you're less skeptical than others. And I said, yeah, I mean, he hasn't proven it yet, but everything I've seen is that it's promising, but the devil's in the details. So they actually hired me to do due diligence on SpaceX, on their engineering processes and their business processes. And so, and there was I had some other consulting gigs around that time that were similarly aligned. There were people in the Air Force that were trying to start the Space Force. And they were like, what are the technologies that are going to be important? And, this company, SpaceX, are they going to really be able to do what they do? Because if they do, we need a Space Force. And so, through a couple of different consulting gigs and so on, I actually spent many days with the team at SpaceX. Got to know the senior management, the senior engineers. There were a couple of guys there, a couple of folks there I didn't really meet. Like Tom Mueller is a huge historical figure. I didn't meet him, but many of the others. And I got to really drill down into how they were doing their engineering, because I was like, I know it's possible to do engineering much more cost effectively than the way I was taught at JPL as a young engineer. I know it's possible because the laws of physics and engineering say it should. but how can you actually do this?
Mm.
And I learned their process, and I realized, holy cow, what they've done is they've taken the methods of agile engineering that were developed in
Mm.
Silicon Valley in the software industry, and they've learned to apply it to space hardware. And it was really a trip. And I really became convinced that they were going to be successful. And so I reported back to my client, yeah, you need to invest in these people and you need to start launching your payloads with them. And I remember I was driving back from the Hawthorne area. It was actually El Segundo with my customer one day. And I was thinking, wow, the dreams of Gerard O'Neill are going to come true. What should I do? And I thought, there's only one thing I can do. And that is I have to fulfill my life ambition and start a company to enable asteroid mining, because asteroid mining is maybe the most important thing humanity can do for the betterment of the human species and the biosphere on Earth. I mean, the two most interesting things that we know about in the universe are the human brain and the terrestrial biosphere.
Mm.
And so providing the environment for humans to thrive for the next 1,000 years and spread throughout the solar system, there is no adventure that could be more important or more meaningful to me. And moving industry off the planet, where we're using robots to manufacture things in space, consuming the materials of the asteroids, that is a noble vision. You know, I actually see a day when you'll drive an autonomous mechatronic transportation unit, things that are derivatives of what we now call cars, that will have been delivered to the Earth from space, made out of asteroids. Now, that's not going to happen next week, but that's where we're going. And then the people in space, millions, and then people will realize space is the place.
Mm.
And, the population of the Earth is already, I think the Earth can actually carry a lot more people than it's currently carrying, but it can't carry 10 or 20 or 50 times more. It can carry maybe a few times more. If we're really careful, we don't, we minimize our pollution impact. We're really careful about how we do agriculture. We make sure we treat nature with respect. We can continue to live on the Earth indefinitely, but we can't have 100 billion people living on the Earth. That's just not tenable. But we can have 1 trillion people living in space, and that's 1,000-year future for humanity. And long before that happens, long before there's 1 trillion people living in space and 1,000 years of future, AI, biotech, we will evolve into whatever it is that is the next stage of evolution from humanity. That's deeply moving and deeply important to me and many of the engineers and scientists at TransAstra.
Yeah, because on top of like proving everyone that the space industry could be like changed and revolutionized, at the same time, like when they manage to show everyone like that it's possible, that it's successful, that you can launch like satellites like cheaper and more efficiently and more frequently, etc. At the same time, you had like a change on the investment community, the VCs starting to get interesting, starting to see like a new opportunity on the market. And I guess like this is what you've been able to seize, like that interest, like get
Yeah.
like those, yeah, that's
Yeah,
that
we
point
are
that you
deep.
benefit.
Yeah, we're deeply grateful to the investors who've invested in TransAstra. We've probably taken a total of about $9 million of private sector investment. Um, uh, and that has been really important to us. The investment community is still working to try to figure out what's a good space investment.
Mm.
There are some companies that are obviously good space investments, like SpaceX.
Mm.
There are a number and then another wonderful company that I love is called Stoke. They have they're like TransAstra, they're a Y Combinator graduate. Relativity is really, there are a number of space companies with tremendous promise. And we feel like we're one of them, and we've got a lot of friends in the industry. And It's just about time for us to start putting some of this technology into space. So you may be hearing some news from us on that soon. And so in
How do
addition
you?
to our revenue growth, separate from the investments, our revenue is growing at about 50% per year. And right now that's mostly government business. And that'll probably continue for a while because the stuff we're doing is pretty cutting edge. And
Mm,
the other thing is the stuff we're doing is infrastructure. It's not end products to deliver data into people's cell phones. Those kind of companies are easier from a commercial perspective, but there are some really challenging problems that we have unique solutions to. Finding debris that could be hazardous in space in critical orbits like GEO. We're exquisitely good at that, better than anyone else. And we're doing that already. You
mm,
know, we are making revenue from that already. Capturing those objects that are not where they should be and dealing with them is an emergent capability that NASA and the Space Force have shown they're really serious. And there's strong commercial applications of that. So expect to hear some announcements from us in the coming year about that I think will be very significant. And then that's all synergistic with our inflatable structures technology for both our capture bags and our solar reflectors, our material processing, and our propulsion. So we're really
mm.
excited about. We're very we're pleased and really proud of our accomplishments over the last few years. Growing from $1 million a year to several. And we're very excited about where we're going and the partnership that we have with the investment community. You have to be a pretty sophisticated. I would, like today I was contacted by an unsophisticated investor asking if he could invest in the company. And I was like, no, you have to be pretty sophisticated and really study the space to get into this space. So I would urge the investment community to think very carefully. But
Mm.
but we're pretty excited about the prospects on the commercial and the government side here.
How far, if you can share, how far do you see or do you estimate us to be able to do asteroid mining in the future? How far is that?
I don't know, Jeremy. There's this one CEO whose name I will not mention, who's always asked schedule stuff, and he always answers the question. And then people say, "Well, he never meets his deadlines."
Yeah, no.
So Jeremy, here's one thing when I'm talking to the old school aerospace people about schedule and cost, because I understand exactly how they work and what their processes are. And I also understand exactly the new agile development methods.
Mm.
And there's something that people don't understand about this game. And that is, if you're doing something that's basically derivative of what you've been doing for 30 years, like putting up another geosat or, landing another rover on Mars, you ought to be able to tell people exactly how much it's going to cost and when it's going to happen. And but if you're doing something that hasn't been done before, and even to an extent, things that have been kind of done before, if you do the traditional systems engineering and project planning on it so that you can tell them exactly what it's going to cost and how long it will take, you can do that.
But you're not going to
But the
get the right
result
estimate.
is,
Yeah.
no, you can actually get the right estimate. But the result is it will cost 5 or 10 times as much as if you use an agile method. And when you're using an agile method, it introduces a lot of uncertainty, more on schedule than cost.
Mm.
So I could answer your question with high certainty if I was willing to spend way too much money to do the job. But I insist on doing it cost effectively, and that means there's schedule uncertainty. This is a fundamental reality of Agile. Because in
Mm.
Agile, and this is why, places like NASA, when they have a failure in development, it's like, But when you're doing agile development, you have to have failures in development because otherwise you're not learning fast enough. But you can't predict exactly how those failures are going to happen, when they're going to happen, and how it's going to affect your schedule. So what you do is you have these milestones that you have to go through. I know I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. And then, it's like we have this expression in Southern California, green lights to Malibu. So you're like, if you're in the airport area and you want to go to Malibu and it's 2 a.m. on a Sunday night, you can get there in 35 minutes. But that's because you're going to hit all green lights on the PCH. But if you're doing agile development, you don't know if you're leaving at 2 a.m. on a Sunday night or rush hour on Tuesday. And if it's traffic and red lights, it depends. And so on a what that CEO who will not be named, when he was always missing his scheduled targets, it's because he has in his mind all the milestones he has to do, and he has a reasonable plan of how to do each one of those milestones. But there's going to be red lights along the way.
Mm.
So I'm not going to sit here and make a projection of the schedule. I would say more than 2 years and less than 10.
Sounds good. I appreciate you try to answer the question.
But really, Jeremy, just now when I was saying that, I wasn't really talking to you. I was talking to the investment community. Yeah. If you want to invest in space and you don't really understand the difference between the traditional, what we call big requirements up front, BRUF, or the V model of systems engineering, and how that compares to the agile approach. By the way, agile aerospace is different than agile software. Failing in hardware and planning and knowing how to do that is a different art form than agile software development. But if you're an investor, you need to understand these things and work with the companies you're investing in. And so, and we wouldn't take money from an investor that doesn't understand that. So actually, I was having a chat with one of my executives who used to be the senior vice president of a different space technology company. And he was talking about how their investors were like, look, we want to fund you to get into space. And we understand there's a high probability of failure. But you have to get into space and at least fail for your next round. And they got into space and they failed and they got their next round. That's because they were working with a sophisticated investor who knew that the most important thing they could do is learn from failure. Sometimes it's better to learn from success. I'll always take that if I can. But if you're not willing to learn from failure, you shouldn't be in this business.
Thank you so much, Joel, for sharing all of that. It's really, really interesting, and I really appreciate that you took the time to share your story today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. This was a delight, and those are great questions.
Thank you so much, and good luck with everything.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.